Do you ever feel like you just can't naturally fit into your family environment, or you can't naturally fit into the mold of society? Like, you notice other people plodding along and managing to make things work for themselves, but something in you just is bothered by it. It doesn't really seem like you fit in the conventional channels. It doesn't really seem like you have those conventional interests. Maybe if you're like me, a lot of those conventional channels just outright don't make sense to you at all. It's almost like you can't fit them into your mental landscape very well. And it leads to a sense of frustration and confusion, and in my case, a lot of anger. And basically, like, just a complete inability to cope with the world as it really, as it is right now. For me, I turned to drugs and I was an addict for about 8 years, just looking for a way to numb a lot of this. I grew up so empathic that I could seriously just sense whatever was going on in my environment. I could sense what was going on in like a subtlety with my parents or like a friend. I could sense when we'd go into a room that there was strange energies moving through it. There was corruption, and I could feel like the sexual intentions of people around me. And honestly, this became so bothersome to me that I would just start withdrawing from like such a young age. I started withdrawing so heavily from maybe even the age of like 4 or 5. From what my mum tells me and like little bits that I remember, like people would actually show some level of interest in me, but I just couldn't handle it. And I would just sort of scurry back, and I was more of an observer. And this sort of eventually just got to the point where about 7, I think my parents just didn't really know what to do about it. I was clearly just very different from a lot of the other kids. It was so obvious. So they actually took me to a psychiatrist, and he gave me an autism diagnosis, autism spectrum disorder. But it was strange because although I had that diagnosis, I still seemed to have I had a lot of this like empathy. I had the ability to like tune into and connect with other people. I just couldn't really deal with the stimulation of a school environment. I couldn't deal with the stimulation of hanging out with a bunch of friends at once and people like getting right up in my face about things. It just made me feel so uncomfortable. And I just did not really feel like I could slot in anywhere. I didn't really know where to go or what to do. So time went on, and primary school came up, the later years of primary school, and this just got worse and worse and worse. Every class I went in, I just did not feel like I could pay attention to any of that information. I released a video a couple of weeks ago explaining why I never went to high school, and you can check that video out. I'll link that in the description below, and that sort of explains where, for me, there was just no real ability to connect in later primary school or high school. And I eventually actually slit my own wrists in a bathroom stall in order to get out of the class. I was like at the point where I was like so desperate to get out that I just grabbed a pair of scissors, went into the bathroom and started scratching my arms up. And yeah, this obviously got my parents and the school's attention, and they removed me from the school. And I was probably about 11 when that happened. Early on in high school, same thing. I just went and almost got I just couldn't pay attention. I was overstimulated all the time. It stressed me out. The very idea of going was becoming just horrible. And when I went, I just had no ability to focus. And I think that my way of coping with that was just to fuck around with other kids, and just to kind of like, the only way I could really stay there and tolerate it was to try to have a bit of fun. But the school I went to was too strict, and it just didn't work out. So I dropped out, and that was only when I was 13. And I remember it was that same year that I got access to smoking weed. I got hard into video games and pornography, and I basically just went harder than any human being usually would with those things, because I was a kid who was so sensitive, looking to escape everything. So I found my own ways of escaping everything. And I got high, and I watched tons of porn, and I played World of Warcraft for like 6,000 plus hours in total over the years. I had a couple of friends, but I just didn't really mold with anything. And it was only as I got a bit older that I started to really get into personal development stuff. I started to learn more about consciousness and spirituality, and even that, like the channels through which most people would go about personal development and spirituality, just didn't really make sense to me. And maybe you can relate. Maybe you feel like no matter what it is that you take up, no matter what it is that you take on, there's almost just like no real way of you naturally clicking into the world, like as if it's just not really made for you, or you feel like a little bit of an alien living on another planet. Like even now, sometimes I've learned so much more about psychology. I've read so many books and I've been in therapy myself. I've got coaching myself. I've really tried to get myself in a position, like, because through everything for me, there's been an overwhelming desire to understand how people work and understand how I work. And through that, I've started to actually get a lot better. But even now, I can still find myself confused by people's motives and behaviors. Like, and that's, I guess, why there was that sort of like autism diagnosis. It's almost like I just didn't really seem to understand why people do what they did. We're used to people just naturally clicking in and understanding, right? It's like, oh, yep, I'm just supposed to assimilate to this, because people just assimilate to their environment naturally. But some of us just never really seem to have the ability to do that. It's like there's no real alternative system at first, though, so we kind of just have to go with it. But something in us feels so distant, so disconnected. And it's pretty obvious a lot of the time if we're exposed to trauma. Like I grew up in a pretty unstable household, in a pretty unstable family. And yeah, it was pretty obvious that I was going to turn to drugs. Like, I mean, drugs were already a thing in my family and they were already a thing in my younger social circles. So it was a moth to a flame kind of situation. And when I found drugs, it was like, oh, okay, I can finally switch off. But that only works for a little bit. So maybe you can relate to all this. Maybe this story just hits something in you, like you don't really quite know what it is maybe, but there's like sort of something inside of you where you feel like, yeah, fuck. It's like, maybe you're even, like I have a friend, for example, who's very similar to me, but he's more, he's acclimated more to like the social climate, but he struggles so much within it. I think the difference is I bailed out so early because it was the only thing I felt like I could do to survive, where for some reason for him, he stayed in it and now he sort of like plays the game, but he just hates it. But he can disguise himself so effortlessly in the system a lot of the time. Not effortlessly for him, but it's seamlessly, rather, I should say. Not effortlessly, seamlessly. He looks so normal in the system. He might even function higher than most people in the system. But deep down, it just doesn't really make sense to him. Maybe you relate to all that. Maybe you feel like you're kindred with me or my friend. So what's actually going on there? Is there something wrong with you? Are you broken? Are you autistic? I mean, you could have autism, you know, maybe. We don't really know. That's the thing. Like I said, I thought I had autism for years, and it was only later in the last few years working with my current psychologist that he's like, you don't have autism at all. You know, you don't really exhibit any of the signs of autism. It's heavily misdiagnosed though, as is ADHD. We tend to not really understand what's going on with people sometimes and why they have such strong resistances to situations. So we just slap disorders on these people. Oh, yep, yeah, you can't pay. Oh, yep. You know, what did it used to be? If you've ever read The Body Keeps the Score, it used to be oppositional defiant disorder, right? Oppositional, oh, you're so defiant. And then we realized there was this thing called trauma, and a lot of people were actually suffering horrific trauma. They were and highly sensitive people suffering trauma. It can really set you on a bad path, right? So how do we make sense of all this? If you relate to all this, how the fuck do we navigate this world? How are we going to make sense of all this? So I'm actually going to be working on a series now. I've been excited to do this. I've really been putting in a lot of time thinking. I know I don't upload too much. I sort of just do these videos where I'll talk and try to make sense of certain things for you guys and for myself. But I'm going to be making a series on what it means to be a highly sensitive person. I'm going to be going deep. I'm going to be cutting into my own personal experience and sharing things that I hope really relate. So you can look forward to that. If you haven't subscribed to the channel and you're here with me now, definitely subscribe so you can get notifications as I start releasing this stuff. Help me spread that message. But for now, let's talk a little bit about how we can actually start to navigate this. So there are a couple things I really want you guys to understand that are going to be crucial here moving forward. So the first one is to recognize, just acknowledge that for whatever reason, and this isn't your fault in any way, but for whatever reason, the way that you've been created, the way that you exist is not on the typical lines. You have a different nervous system, you have a different brain, you perhaps have a rarer personality type. For example, for me, I believe myself to be somewhere between IFSP and INFP. They're the kind of types that I resonate with. They're both rather rare types for the male population and just the population in general, to be honest. So what happens is when you actually have a rarer personality type, you have a rarer constitution, you don't tend to just be able to fit into society so willy-nilly. It doesn't really work for you. Our society values traits like conscientiousness, industriousness, where our traits tend to be higher in like empathy, compassion. And empathy and compassion don't just mean like, oh, you're just like a weak, oh, you're just you take everything in. It's like, no, it means that we're highly sensitive to what we feel around us. We observe, we notice subtleties in our environment that a lot of people wouldn't pick up on. We notice these certain threads. We're very sensitive to what I call atmosphere. And I don't just necessarily mean like what's going on in the air. I mean the emotional air of a room. We can feel into it. Maybe some of us are even so spiritually sensitive that we're sensitive to energies that we don't even understand as a humanity yet most of the time. And this can all get very confusing. So that first thing is to just acknowledge that in yourself. Acknowledge that there's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. You're a sensitive person. You are your own unique constitution. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, if you knew how to tap into your own value, you would recognize that not only is there nothing wrong with you, but there's so much right with you. And that's what we're going to be doing here. I want you guys to follow me along on this journey so we can start making sense of those of us who have more unique introverted personality types and how this can actually be a major strength and an incredible thing for humanity moving forward. And in the past, it has been in the past. So that first thing is to acknowledge. Recognize your uniqueness, recognize there's nothing wrong with you. The second thing is to apply compassion to yourself. Give yourself the compassion that you need. Know that it is really difficult if you are a sensitive person to navigate this life. It's really difficult, to meet new people and to connect with new people because you can feel so much at once. It's really difficult to fit into a working environment, particularly if you don't really understand why you're doing what you're doing. You're just doing it because you were told you need to do it. If you're doing that and you're just right in the eye of the hurricane of all of this emotional, psychological exchange going on in your workplace every day, it's going to be a lot for you. I want you to acknowledge that and have compassion for yourself. The basic tenets of compassion are self-kindness, relatability and connectedness, knowing that there are other people who are going through what you're going through. If you relate to this, then you know that I'm going through what you're going through, and I've managed to make headway with it. And I'm going to be helping you guys with that moving forward as much as I can. And on top of that, it's also to be mindful. Compassion is about being mindful of what's going on inside of us. So have compassion for yourself, for how you are. There's nothing wrong with you, once again. There's actually so much right with you. It's just sometimes the mold of society we don't really fit in with naturally. The other thing is actually undergoing healing. This only really takes place if the other two steps I've just mentioned are present, but it's being able to undergo healing. A lot of the time, if we're highly sensitive, like, let me just introduce a notion to you. Like, I just want you to imagine this. Whether you're a highly sensitive person or you're not, maybe you're a more extroverted person, you're just interested in watching this, and you stayed with me up until this point. Imagine you're a highly sensitive person, meaning you're potentially hundreds of times potentially more sensitive than someone who wouldn't be, than a normie. And you're growing up in an environment where you can feel strong emotional energy, even if it's at a subtle level. But then you have a parent who is dealing with terrific trauma themselves, who is who has rage emanating out of them, who's constantly stressed about money, who physically assaults you, for example, or some of you even to the point where, you know, you've experienced sexual abuse. Imagine that anyway, how awful that is for anyone anyway. And we know that trauma affects everyone uniquely. It has a unique, horrible effect on every human being. But then imagine you're hundreds of times more sensitive and you're undergoing that. This can get to the point where if you don't end up just taking your own life, you're likely to get caught up in any kind of addiction just to try to manage the fact that your nervous system has been clocked from day one, overclocked. It's almost like you're ticking on overdrive forever, and then we're expected to go just function in the world. Go do this, go do that. Oh yeah, you need to do it. Then if you can't function at that pace, we're told, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to be at the lowest pecking order of society, end up miserable in a shitty position because you can't really fit in, because you don't really know how to work around these things. The good news is there are ways of working around it. There are ways where you can have a fulfilling line of work, fulfilling relationships. You can actually pursue your interests and share your natural gifts with the world as an introvert, as a highly sensitive person, even if you've had a really difficult past like this. Take my word for that. And as I said, we're going to be making a whole series. I'm really excited to share some of these things with you guys moving forward. There's just a little bit of stuff right now. This is sort of just something I'm making as a kind of a trailer and a relatability point. I really hope that you guys get some value out of this and you hear something you really relate to, because this is not always easy when you're in this position. And so many of us are struggling in silence, suffering in silence, and we're going to break that mold and we're going to build something bigger between us. That's my goal. That's what I'd love to do. That's what I feel like I'm here to do. And yeah, if you got value out of this, subscribe to the channel, helps me spread the message. Like the video and comment down below for the algorithm so I can spread this even further and we can grow this up together, even if you just comment algorithm. Yeah, I hope you're having a beautiful day, and that's me.